We talk about translation. We talk about going from bench to bedside. And so we started at the bench with our diabetic animals, and then we were able to show, okay, this looks like we have an early screening and we have a treatment. Can we try it in patients?
Welcome to Holy Shift, Biomedical Breakthrough Shaping Tomorrow. What is biomedical engineering exactly? It's about engineering solutions that improve human health, from new medical imaging tools to personalized cancer treatments. Holy Shift reveals the people, passion, and purpose powering the future of biomedical research. On today's episode, we're talking about the science of sight and how researchers are working to protect vision before problems even begin. We're joined by Dr. Machelle Pardue, whose work tackles some of the world's most common eye diseases, from diabetic retinopathy to the growing epidemic of nearsightedness, using innovative experiments that connect how our eyes respond to light with real-world treatments now moving into clinical trials. She shares how curiosity, unexpected career turns, and bold ideas are helping reshape the future of vision care. Why don't you go ahead and kick us off by telling us a little bit about who you are, what research you do within the department, and then we're going to dig in for a little bit more detail.
Great. I am a professor that is in ophthalmology as well as biomedical engineer. And I also have a joint appointment with the Atlanta VA Medical Center. And my research is really all about eyes. So I'm interested in studying eyes and trying to look for treatments for different types of eye disease that cause patients to lose vision. And so my whole goal is to develop these different treatments that will keep patients from losing their eyesight.
Amazing. Okay. And I know that what is really cool, because the eye is a very complex structure, and you focus on two specific disease areas within the eye. So can you tell us from a very elevator pitch high level what those two areas are?
Yeah. So the first one is a condition called diabetic retinopathy. And this is a condition that develops in patients that have diabetes. So, we're all very familiar with patients who have diabetes. Maybe somebody in your family has diabetes. And over time, they end up getting these different complications. And one of the complications is this eye disorder, this retinopathy, and it will cause vision loss eventually over time.
So is that, when I hear retinopathy, is that degrading of the retina?
That word is often what we think about.
Okay.
But this disease actually has first been characterized by changes in the blood vessels in the eye. So one of the things that happens in diabetes, a lot of the conditions and complications are because changes happen to those blood vessels. They become leaky or weak. And when that happens, then of course they're not functioning properly, and the tissue around them doesn't get the right nutrients and oxygen and all the things that blood is supposed to give. And so then that causes the tissue to have, problems. And so that's what happens in the eye, that these blood vessels become leaky, and they you can actually see, if you look inside the eye with a camera called a fundus camera, then you can look inside the eye and see those blood vessels and see that they're becoming leaky or they have some other changes. And so that's actually the number one way that we screen and diagnose this disease right now. And what is startling about this is it takes 10 to 15 years to develop those blood vessels abnormalities from the time you were first diagnosed with diabetes.
Okay.
So what disturbed me when we started working on this project is that you have all these, people out there with diabetes who are waiting 10 years, who are supposed to be going every year to get this annual screen. Of course, people don't because...
Is it the same type of screen that someone who doesn't have diabetes or would have at the eye doctor, or is it a specialized one that they would get?
Good question. So it is very similar to what a normal eye exam would be, but unfortunately, most of us don't go and get an eye exam every year. Yeah. Me too, unfortunately. But if you have diabetes, your diabetes doctor will actually tell you to go and get a yearly screen for this. And there's actually places where you can go and you can just get this one fundus image, and then it goes and gets read somewhere, and they tell you whether you have a problem. But for some people it takes a long time, and so that, in those 10 to 15 years, there are things going on. We just haven't detected it, right? And so my lab was very interested in determining, well, what is going on? How can we figure out some subtle change that maybe the person isn't aware of, but we could detect that would allow us to say, yes, you're getting, some sort of, retinal issue. Now we can treat that. So that's what we, started to do is we took some animal models, we could make them diabetic. We then looked very carefully over time as they developed the diabetes to see what changes they had. And we found that there was this functional change. And so this gets a little bit more complicated, but if you stick with me here, you can actually do electrophysiological tests. So when we think about, some sort of test to measure function, the one that I'm most familiar with, I think most people would be, is the EKG. So we get, stickers stuck on our chest, like these are electrodes, right? And you're at the doctor and they get a very characteristic waveform, right? And we then know the function of the heart, right? You can basically do that for the eye.
Oh, that is
so
very cool.
We can put electrodes either just on the surface of the eye or a sticker right under the eye.
Okay.
And then we flash a light at the eye. And when we do that, we can get a characteristic waveform, this little wave, and it comes from certain cells within the retina. And so it's very characteristic. So we were doing that, and we were able to determine that there was a part of that wave that changed. It became more delayed very early in the disease, and nobody else had ever found that before. And interestingly, it is a part of the wave that clinically is not looked for. And so we discovered something that, this might actually be an early screening tool that we could use. And so, so we started to look at that, and that was pretty exciting. But of course, if you have a screening tool, it's only good if you can actually treat, right? And
because it's not very fun to know that you have something if you can't treat. And there are a lot of instances like that today, right?
Yeah,
so this is
absolutely
huge.
Yeah, and like right now, all the treatments in the toolbox, the clinical toolbox, all have to do with blood vessels, right? But this functional change that we're seeing may be due to the neurons in the retina and not due to the vasculature. And so we needed to find a different treatment. And so about the same time, and just serendipitous and very lucky, a MD PhD student in my lab said, well, what about if we look at dopamine? So dopamine, people usually think of as being in the brain, and it's something that goes up when we exercise and it makes us happy. And well, we also have dopamine in the retina, and it's involved in a lot of different things in the retina. And there was evidence in the literature that dopamine decreases in patients that have diabetes. And so it actually decreases everywhere. It decreases in the brain, in the eye, in the kidneys. And so he said, let's look to see if it's decreased in our retinas. And it was in these diabetic animals we had. And we can actually restore dopamine by giving a drug that we give to patients with Parkinson's disease who also have decreases in dopamine. And the drug's called levodopa. So this is a drug that already exists. And if we give that to these diabetic animals, then we can preserve their function. And so we then had a treatment that we could pursue and see if
Okay, I want to ask a question really quick, and I want to get a little bit more into this. But taking it back a little bit, so if this research does not exist, as of today, okay, let's just say I have diabetes, and I, am 20 years in, and suddenly I start having complications with my eye from this. What does it look like without any treatment at all? Like, how does that manifest for the patient?
Yeah. So they might notice that they're having visual disruptions, right? But usually they don't. So usually the first thing that they know that they have some sort of retinal change that's happening is that fundus image, that picture of the inside of the eye that actually shows that there's something happening with the blood vessels.
Okay.
But when those blood vessels become leaky, you can imagine that blood just kind of flows out and diffuses out into the retinal tissue, and that causes the tissue to swell. And when the tissue swells, it doesn't function very well.
Right.
And so then just stuff begins to look blurry, right?
But it probably is a slow fade, and you don't realize what you're losing.
It's absolutely. And visual system is really, really good at compensating. So that's why, you're supposed to go and get your eyes checked to see, okay, is there something there?
I'm now encouraged to go get my eyes checked. So, side note. Okay, so you might not see that, but if you have this instance where then earlier on,
right.
you can, and I'm trying to make sure that I understand this correctly, but if earlier on you can identify in this subset of patients that this is occurring and you're able to give this drug that's already on the market with other uses, then you slow down the progression of this impact, which allows your vision and other consequences of that to be preserved.
Exactly. So if you can, this is true for really any disease, if we could detect it really early and start to treat it, then you won't end up with the late stage, changes that happen. So in this case, if the diabetic retinopathy was left untreated, that person would eventually go blind.
Okay, that's I was curious.
They definitely would, right?
Yes.
So, but there are some treatments in the clinic that we do, but the major one that's used right now is an eye injection. So where you actually inject.
Yes, I cringed.
Yeah, I cringe too. But it's actually done, fairly common in the clinic anymore, that there's a drug. It's these type of drug called anti-VEGF, and it's injected into the eye, and this helps to keep the blood vessels from changing and from having this abnormal growth or just responding to these changes in the disease. So I don't want to sign up for blood, for injections in my eye. So if you told me, okay, you can take this oral pill, 10 years before you're actually going to develop these vascular changes, sign me up, right?
Yes,
I'm going to go do that.
That's huge.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the idea, is if you can detect it early, then you could, provide some sort of treatment. And we're very focused on this one drug, this levodopa, but actually I think there's a number of things you could do in this very early stage, because it's a class of treatments just called neuroprotection. And my lab's also done other things with neuroprotection, like exercise or other kind of things that you maybe even think of them a little bit like supplements that you could take that would maybe decrease inflammation and oxidative stress and things that we think of as just being associated with disease. So it's very possible that those could have a big effect on the eye if you just started them at the right time.
Right.
And so the screening tool would allow us to know, this individual actually needs that help right now.
This is amazing. Okay, so where does it stand? We've taken it a little bit from like a hypothesis to serendipitous moment where you found the dopamine, and now you're seeing this as a screening tool and potentially something that you can now implement to change it. Right. Where's the research at now?
Yeah, so so this is kind of the exciting part, and I think the part that, as a researcher, you hope that your research will do this. We talk about translation, we talk about going from bench to bedside. And so we started at the bench with our diabetic animals, and then we were able to show, okay, this looks like we have an early screening and we have a treatment. Can we try it in patients? So I already told you that this drug, levodopa, is already FDA approved. We're already using it in other patients. So you can repurpose a drug for another purpose. And so we went ahead and did a clinical trial, a small clinical trial. We took patients that had diabetes, but had no signs of any retinal changes. Those fundus images looked normal. And then we did our test, this little, ERG, this, test for the eye function, and we found about half of them had delays. Half of them had the change that we had seen in our animals. So that was a lot more than I expected, actually. So it was like, wow, okay, so there is a change, and it's similar to what we saw in our animal model, so that's always good. And then we gave them the drug, and they only took it for 2 weeks, and it actually restored their function back to normal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think I know the answer to this question in my head, but one would almost say, well, why wouldn't you just give the drug to all diabetic patients?
Yep. You could, but you always are worried about side effects.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
Yes.
And it's the key that I wanted to ask that question because I know a listener is thinking that piece.
Right.
But there is a piece in medicine about why we don't do that, because it's easy to forget the side effects in other areas and that something like dopamine does have an impact in many other areas of the body.
No, it does. And so you always need to be careful about side effects, and that's why we test drugs. And even if you're repurposing a drug to another disease, you still want to make sure that at that dose, you're not getting any kind of side effects. And so, from our experience so far, this drug seems to be fine for this population. But yes, I would encourage the listeners to not take levodopa unless you are under the care of a doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and also our public service announcement, go and get your eyes checked. So
Yes.
I'm now thinking I need to schedule that. Yeah. Okay, so what is next for this? And then I want to hear about the other research that you do that also deals with the eyes, because I think we often forget, like those of us who are not in that research, once again, we're not going to see the eye doctor, okay? And it's a slow fade when something is happening. We don't even realize that. We forget how beautiful and bright things were, right?
Right, absolutely.
But there are many different things that can be impacted with the eyes.
Yeah.
So tell us what's next with this, and then I want to hear a little bit about the other research you do.
Great. So the next piece is for us to do two things. One thing is that we actually put a patent on or submitted a patent in order to build a device that would do the screening that I just described. And so we're trying to build that and working with a company who will hopefully create some sort of device that we could use in the clinic. And so maybe someday the diabetic patient comes in and they're having their usual workup just to check on their diabetes, and the doctor will say, okay, we're going to do the screening test for your eyes. And they put this device on them. I imagine it as being some sort of wearable device, and they test to see if there's any changes in function in the retina. And if there is, they'll say, okay, you either need to go to the ophthalmologist, or maybe we just give you this treatment, and then we'll check back when you come back.
Okay, I have a question. Is this company that you're working with a startup company here in Atlanta?
No.
Okay. Okay. Well, because, I'm all about startup companies here in Atlanta. So maybe there's an opportunity in the future for that. Okay, so that's amazing. And also to be able to do it in a clinic and to make it very usable in that space is really great, because we want access to everyone.
Right. So the device, like creating a device would be huge. And then the other thing is we just need to learn more about it. So treating for a longer period of time. I said we only treated for 2 weeks. That's not very long.
Right.
And so we need to be able to treat for like 6 months. And so right now the studies we have going on in my lab are for 6 months.
Okay.
And so we're trying to, determine how that works. Or if you started the treatment at a much later stage of disease, is that still beneficial, right? So do we have to get in this little window, or could we do it? So, research just takes so much time, right? And it's even frustrating for us as scientists. It just takes a long time to build this story. And, certainly the goal is to create something that's very usable and accessible to patients and clinicians, but we don't want to do that haphazardly. We need to be very careful and methodical on how we develop that. So,
this is amazing. Okay, and now let's talk about the other research you do on the eye.
So the other part of my research in my lab is focused on a disease called myopia, or nearsightedness. So this is the reason most of us wear glasses, especially children. And so if you're nearsighted, you can see things that are really close up, but you can't see things that are far away. And how this happens is during childhood, the eye grows too fast and too large for the power of the eye. So you get an eye that's kind of elongated, you can imagine. And it turns out that the number of people who have myopia has steadily risen all over the world in the last 50 to 70 years. And if you look at a plot, it's like kind of exponential, that it keeps going up.
Wow.
So what this means is that this isn't just a genetic trait, right? Because if it was a genetic trait, we wouldn't expect it to happen so fast. It would happen very slowly. But here, it's happening so quickly that it has to have an environmental factor. And so this then gets really interesting, right? Okay, well, what environmental factor could all these children be exposed to that's leading to this, big increase in myopia? And the field has really looked at this, from all sides, trying to figure it out. And, people have looked at near work. So a lot of people who have myopia are very studious. They've spent a lot of time in school. And so it's like, it must be near work. Maybe. But when you're doing near work, you're often inside. And that means you're not outside in the sun.
Right.
And so another theory is that it's actually because you don't have enough sunlight. And you really need sunlight in order to help the eye to grow appropriately. So those are kind of like two theories that are very common. People also often ask me, well, it has to be gadgets like, phones, iPads, all these kind of devices that we watch because, children, you see, even young children, like, looking at things that are very close. Not really any true evidence that that's the cause either. Like maybe all combined, but this is what my lab is trying to understand is the mechanism that what kind of environmental factors are at play and how can we, identify those. And then once we identify them, then we could make recommendations of, oh, you need to do this. The children need more time outside, or recess definitely has to be outside, or maybe we put certain type of light in the classroom so that, that whatever the retina needs to grow normally is actually there.
Oh, that is fascinating. Okay, so these are two very different areas of research, both on one organ of our body. Tell us a little bit more about the funding that makes these possible. Are they both through the same mechanism, or do you get funding from different sources? And if so, why? Like, what's the benefits of that?
Yeah, so great question. So I have all federal funding, and the diabetic retinopathy project that we talked about has actually been all funded through the VA. So many people don't know that the VA does have its own research, this intramural research program, and I have been part of that my whole career. And so they are interested in research that improves veteran healthcare. That is their mission. And so this obviously diabetes is a big issue in veterans. And so they would be very interested in my research that would improve, eye health for this population. And so they've been interested in funding that. And so that's where that project is supported. And then for the myopia project, it has been funded by the National Institute of Health, and specifically the National Eye Institute. And so they are, focused on that as, a clinical condition that we need to understand so we can treat it better.
Okay, so we have to pause then and thank both the VA and the National Institute of Health, because these are huge things that will impact everyone in society. And I think that is so amazing.
Yeah, so, these are major diseases. So, we didn't talk about numbers very much, right? But the number of people who have diabetes in the U.S. is immense. We're talking millions of people. And so we, that's a it's a big impact on the amount of money we spend to care for them, right? And if we can improve their vision, then that's going to decrease cost, overall healthcare costs, right? On the myopia side, the prediction is by the year 2050, 50% of the world's population is going to have myopia. And that includes in the U.S. So that's a lot of people. And so, so again, the money that comes in to support projects like these really does help, improve the healthcare, and particularly in these examples, eye care of the American citizens, yes.
And what I like to think about is that there is some future, let's just say future grandparent who now is going to be able to see their grandchildren and the things that they do so much better than they ever would because of early interventions, because of this. So that is just changing the quality of life of people, and memories and family is really important.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, if you ask people, like, what's the number one thing they're afraid of losing, it's actually eyesight.
Yes.
And so, so I totally agree. And I think we don't really realize how many different visual impairments there are out there. So, we've been talking all about retina, but there's a large population of people who have corneal issues, dry eye, for instance, that really is painful and also decreases your vision. So if you add up all the different diseases, diabetic retinopathy, myopia, dry eye, cataracts, almost everybody gets a cataract. It's really rare that somebody not. It's like the number one surgery around the world that gets done. It's like half of the U.S. population has visual impairments. It's huge. Of some sort, right?
Okay, so when you were 5 years old, did you say, I want to cure all these conditions of the eye? What did you want to do when you were 5?
So I don't remember exactly when I was 5, but I have a very distinct memory of being in 3rd grade and taking a health class.
Okay.
And I remember the teacher, I remember the class, I can even still picture the book, the textbook we were using.
Wow, that's impressive.
And, yeah, and it really made an impact on me. And I very much loved just learning about the wonders of the human body and like how it all functions and learning about disease. And so from third grade, for many years after that, I said I was going to be a doctor. And I think that I chose that because that was the only thing I could associate with that was a job related to these topics, right?
Makes sense.
So when I got to college, I kind of looked around and I was like, well, yeah, doctor would be an option, but I don't know if that's really what I want to do. Maybe I want to do something else. But I wasn't sure what it was. And so then I ended up getting married when I was an undergrad, which is really rare in my academic world. But we're still together, so it well worked out.
Congratulations.
And so we, my husband knew he wanted to go to grad school. And so we ended up at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, where he was studying history. And so that was a good place for him to go. And I was looking for what we now call as a gap year. So just a job to kind of think about what I wanted to do. And I ended up at the School of Optometry. And I think because they had this health connection, right? Okay, well, at least they're studying, some part of the body and it's kind of clinically relevant. So let me see what they have. And kind of ironically, the person I met there, the professor, was very interested in my degree, which was zoology. So looking at the comparison of different animals, and I'm very interested in animals, still am today. And that's actually why he was interested in me as a student and said, come and be my student. And I was like, I don't think so. And he was like, yeah, I think you should really come and be a student. And he, convinced me finally to do that. And as they say, kind of the rest is history, because I fell in love with the eye and being able to study it and have, developed.
But you fell in love with studying the eye in animals first, right?
I did. And my work was, mostly in animals, but I've always had a strong tie to human disease.
Yeah, I love this.
Yeah. So even in my PhD thesis, I was looking at what makes our eyes change its focus so we can go from near to far. So this changes the lens inside our eye. I was studying that in animals with a very distinct application to what's happening in humans. So all my research has always been very applicable in that way. I'm always really interested in the disease and how can we model the disease in the animal model or translate it to the people and do a human study.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you made that journey through there. Okay, so I know a couple of things about you as well is that you love to bake. Mm-hmm. I have to ask, do you know where the idea of carrots and helping the eye came from?
I don't know.
I heard it could be some urban legend on that, so I'm not going to put something out into the ethernet that might be wrong. But tell us about your baking and your passion for that.
Yeah, so I think even when I was pretty young, I always loved to bake. So, my thing was to go into the kitchen and bake a cake of some sort. And as, I've, grown my family, I always made special birthday cakes for my kids and, all that. And at this point, at this phase in my life, I make a lot of pies, especially at Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. So we make a lot of pies, and even if there's a small group, we'll make 5 or 6 pies, just because that's the time of year you make pies. So,
I love it. Okay, but do you make carrot cake?
I do make carrot cake. Yes, I do. Yes, with cream cheese frosting. It's really good.
That's amazing. Yeah. Okay, now I'm hungry. So I want to ask as well, have you had one of those holy shift moments, that moment that really shifts your whole mind, your whole perspective on something? And have you had one of those that even relates to the research and the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think that that would be going back to this diabetic retinopathy project and having this MD PhD student in the lab who said, hey, let's look at dopamine. So I would have never guessed that dopamine would have played a role in this disease. And I'm always amazed at the serendipity of kind of life. And also so I'm a huge advocate of team science, that we really can do so much more, and we can be so much more innovative and look at things from all these different directions when we have more members of the team and diverse members of the team, right, that have different perspectives. And so I'm not sure that I would have pieced those together, but the student did, right? And that allowed us to explore that, and it turned out to be really interesting, right? And it's another whole area of research now that I followed for many years. And yeah, so I think that is kind of the aha moment for me. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. That is really important. Okay, so what is one thing, if the listeners forget everything we talked about right now, what are a couple of things that you want to make sure that they take home out of this message?
So I think a couple things that are really important. One is that vision science and vision research is really important. As I mentioned, actually, there's a huge number of people that have some sort of visual impairment of some sort, right? That it's something that affects their eyes and how they see. And even though these things don't kill us, or we're not dropping dead because we can't see, it greatly affects your quality of life.
Yes.
Immensely. And depending on when you're experiencing this, it also affects your ability to work. And so then it affects your ability to, have income, to bring in income. And so, so being able to support vision research that actually allows us to develop new treatments that will prevent these different types of eye conditions is really important.
Alrighty, so we absolutely want to support that. And thank you so much for the work that you do. Yeah. It's very fascinating. I cannot wait to hear the advances. I can't wait to see some of those devices in clinics all over the world that give access to everyone to have better eyesight for the rest of their lives. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, that is another episode of the Holy Shift podcast. We're really grateful that you joined us today. Hope you took a few messages away, including scheduling that annual eye appointment. That's it for this episode of Holy Shift, Biomedical Breakthroughs Shaping Tomorrow. If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, pass it along to someone eager to explore the power of research to change lives. As a reminder, the opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and do not represent those of any organization mentioned. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. To learn more about the research featured on this show, visit bme.gatech.edu or check the show notes for links and resources. Thanks for listening, and remember, behind every innovation is a purpose, a person, and a powerful story.